It's terrible. It's horrible. I mean, why should any government ever trust what the U.S., what the Germans, what the French have done? Why should the Russian Federation trust anything that these three countries have so blatantly acknowledged to the world? Their duplicity, their lying. So, as the Russian Federation, I mean, there's nothing that gives them confidence and trust.
Let's talk about this counteroffensive, this Ukrainian counteroffensive. In the mainstream media, they were talking about this counteroffensive for 7 months, 6 months. They were training Ukrainians, sending weapons to Ukraine. How did you see this counteroffensive?
Well, I see the counteroffensive and the whole issue of the Russian attack on Ukraine and then the Ukrainian response as something that must end. I mean, I'm for peace in Ukraine, stopping the killing, get a ceasefire, and then let the parties discuss however they want to resolve this issue. My whole point as a peace activist is that we have to end wars and not let them start. And this whole thing of the Russian decision to attack and invade Ukraine was preventable. There were options that the Russian Federation had, but they were being put in a corner by the U.S. and NATO in its continuing push for Ukraine to join NATO, even though they were saying it won't be for years, it won't be this, it won't be that. They were also having massive military war games right on the border of Russia. And the U.S. established 2 new military bases, the first new bases in Europe in 60 years, put them right on the border with Russia. So the provocations that the Russian Federation felt that it was getting from the U.S. and NATO tragically led them to the decision that they would attack Ukraine, which was a terrible, terrible decision. And they're not the first country to, of course, make these terrible decisions. If you look back 20 years ago, that's when the U.S. attacked Iraq, a country that had nothing to do with 9/11. And the Bush administration went ahead and had a disastrous war on Iraq that killed tens of thousands, if not millions, of Iraqis. And it was just horrible. So the Russians kind of are following in the game plan of the U.S., but they too, like the U.S., will ultimately have to come to some sort of an agreement to end the killing that they are doing, as the U.S. killed in Iraq and in Afghanistan. So, as a peace activist, we sometimes get a lot of criticism because we're not firmly saying, yes, Ukraine has a right to defend itself, which it does, but what we would rather see is the concerted effort by the Russian government, the Ukrainian government, the U.S. government, and NATO to say, okay, enough is enough. Let's stop this killing, and let's resolve these political issues with words instead of killing people.
We had this opportunity to solve these problems in 2014. The president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, he was trying to make some kind of equilibrium between West and East, between Russia and the West, because right after that we had this coup in Ukraine, and everyone knows what happened in that coup. It seems to me that every time Russia tries to solve the situation in Ukraine, even democratically, without any war, it was all rejected by the U.S. How do you see this?
Well, I agree with you. I think the U.S. is a culprit in this war in terms of pushing Russia into a corner. And as we've heard U.S. diplomats and politicians and military from the United States say that this is an opportunity to weaken the Russian Federation. It's a terrible, terrible statement that our elected leaders have made. And the fact that the U.S. was a part of that coup in 2014 2014 that overthrew a democratically elected government. And Victoria Nuland, who at the time was the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs for the U.S. State Department, you know, we know that she had a telephone conversation right in the middle of the coup saying, yeah, we want to get our guy Yachts in there. Well, unfortunately, she is now the acting Deputy Secretary of State, the number 2 in the State Department. So you can see that we have warmongers in the State Department. She was in during the Obama administration, 2014, and then back in the Biden administration now. So she is a symbol of the warmongers that we have in the U.S. government.
If we look back at these opportunities that we've lost to solve the situation in Ukraine, 2014, we had 2 agreements, Minsk 1 and Minsk 2, in 2014 and 2015, which later by Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande, they were talking, these agreements were a sham. They were playing with Russia just to build up the Ukrainian military, to confront Russia, not to negotiate with Russia. How do you see the role of these government, these politicians, in what's happening in Ukraine right now?
Well, these politicians join with the United States in these sham agreements, as you mentioned. It's terrible. It's horrible. I mean, why should any government ever trust what the U.S., what the Germans, what the French have done? Why should the Russian Federation trust anything that these 3 countries have so blatantly acknowledged to the world? Their duplicity, their lying. So as the Russian Federation, I mean, there's nothing that gives them confidence and trust that anything that the U.S., NATO, Germany, France says is really the truth and that would be followed through on it. So it's a real tragedy because it means that the probability of a ceasefire, which would, we hope, end the killing, is a long way off. And if we look at other ceasefires or other conflicts that have happened in the world, just having a ceasefire does not mean that you're going to have a peace agreement anytime soon. If you look at the Korean War back, this 70 years ago, the negotiations to end the war, it was only a 3-year war, but one of the most destructive wars in the history of humanity. In 3 years, like 5 million people were killed in it. 4 million at least Koreans, North and South both, 500,000, 500,000 Chinese. The U.S. had 30,000 that were killed in 3 years, whereas in Vietnam, the U.S. had 55,000, and that was a 15-year war. Well, in the Korean War, the negotiations to end the war started in the 2nd year. So you had year 2 and year 3. There were 575 meetings before finally an armistice, not even a peace treaty, but an armistice was signed. That armistice is the thing that's in effect right now, not a peace treaty. And that's really why the North Koreans have developed their ballistic missiles, have tested nuclear weapons, because there's no peace treaty. It's just an armistice. And they know the history of the United States and its attempt to overthrow governments around the world. If you look at Vietnam, a 15-year war that the U.S. waged on the Vietnamese people, the negotiations started in like 1968. There was a peace agreement, finally, a peace treaty in 1975. So that was 7 years of killing that went on before finally there was a peace agreement. So as much as we call for ceasefire and hoping it's going to end the killing, because of the duplicity that we've seen by all of these, the countries of the West, for sure, the probability that the Russian Federation is going to sign on to something that they are pretty sure the West is going to negate and not follow through on, is low. And tragically, there are going to be a lot more Ukrainians and a lot more Russians that are going to be dead by the time this is finished.
Putin mentioned two reasons for this so-called special military operation in Ukraine. He said that it was one of the reasons was NATO expansion, and the other was this conflict between ethnic Russians in the eastern part of Ukraine. He tried to solve the problem of these ethnic Russians in those agreements, Minsk I and Minsk II, which didn't go the way he wanted to be. We see Ukrainian government was attacking these eastern ethnic Russians. They were killed by something. Some reports shows that it was 14,000 people were killed during 8 years. It's so horrendous to look at these results, what they've been doing. The other part of his argument in this war was this NATO expansion. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had various chunks of this expansion. Wright came at the doorstep of Russia in Ukraine. Why there is a necessity of having Ukraine as a member of NATO? Why Ukraine cannot be something like Austria? That is so good, that is working, that's functioning. But they were pushing all these policies during the last 23 years, and nobody was paying attention to what are the Russian concerns when they're looking at this NATO expansion.
Well, and I think it's an offensive rather than a defensive coalition. If you look at what NATO has been involved in, most recently, they've been involved in Afghanistan, they've been involved in Libya, they've been involved in a lot of different things that you would say were not truly defending Europe, but were being offensive, an offensive arm of the U.S. Foreign and military policy. I would say that also the expansion of NATO began just as soon as Bill Clinton came into office, and right after George W. Bush, who had agreed with, and his Secretary of State, James Baker, had agreed with Gorbachev that they would not move 1 inch into the old Warsaw Pact. Well, I was a U.S. diplomat during that time in the 1990s, and I was assigned in Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. And those two countries, well, virtually all the countries, the Warsaw Pact countries, and then the countries in Central Asia, were immediately contacted by the U.S. government to say, don't you want to join our partnerships for NATO, our partnerships for this and that. And so it started out just being the partner, not a full member of anything, just being a partner and having a military relationship with the U.S. We had U.S. ambassadors, particularly Bill Burns, who's now the director of the CIA, who, as the U.S. ambassador to Russia, wrote an email or a cable back to Washington. The title of the cable was "Niet means niet," no means no, and there's really been no one in the U.S. government who's ever written that, okay, it's okay. The Russian Federation says it's okay. They won't be their security won't be jeopardized by Ukraine joining NATO. In fact, it was totally the opposite. And many U.S. government officials told the various administrations that this was a bad idea. And yet the decision was, let's just keep pushing and poking and provoking the Russian Federation. And ultimately that provocation ended up with first the Russian Federation sending 100,000 troops right on the border with Ukraine. That when that happened, when I saw that, it was like, oh my God, okay, well, now this is the decision of the Russian Federation. They are willing to put military action into this, but hoping at the same time that this would be a clear signal to the U.S. and NATO to stop what they were doing, which was the provocation of Russia and the supplying of the Ukraine with military training and military equipment, which started right after 2014, where the U.S. was sending in special forces people to train those Ukrainian units that were shelling the Donbas region and that had caused the 14,000 deaths that you refer to. But no, that was not enough to deter the United States in its willingness to provoke Russia to the extent that Russia replied with the tragic, horrible invasion into Ukraine, which has caused the loss of life on both the Ukrainian side and the Russian side.
The Biden administration missed a lot of opportunities to solve this situation. Even in December 2021, Putin sent 2 letters to the Biden administration and the NATO headquarters, asking for negotiations, for more negotiations based on those Minsk 1 and Minsk 2. And Biden refused to negotiate with Putin. And even after going inside Ukraine, those forces, 100,000 soldiers were inside Ukraine. He started again before this war getting started. These soldiers were inside Ukraine, but they didn't start anything. They started negotiating again in March 2022 with the Zelensky administration. They wanted to solve this situation. But suddenly Zelensky decided not going along with those agreements, decided to go to war with Russia. And how do you see the role of the Biden administration in the whole situation that has happened in those days?
Well, the U.S. was not about to push Ukraine to negotiate, and in fact, they sent their Biden version of the lapdog of the UK, Boris Johnson. You know, in 2003 and 4, the lapdog of the United States in the UK was Tony Blair, who justified the U.S. going into Iraq. And in the same way, the Biden administration pushed, well, I don't think pushed, I think Boris Johnson was ready to say, oh yeah, just don't negotiate at all with Russia on this. This is, you have to stand up to them. And it's been a very lucrative weapons sales or weapons giveaway by both the US, the UK, and other NATO members to send in military equipment, which then has to be resupplied in their own chain, which means the US Defense Department buys again more weaponry to replace that they've sent to Ukraine. So it's a big winner deal for all of the merchants of death, the corporations that manufacture all of these horrific weapons. So there are a lot of people and a lot of organizations in the U.S. that don't mind war at all. In fact, that's how they thrive. They make money on war. So the think tanks that we have in the United States, that many of them are funded by war corporations, and who have writers and pundits whose whole careers depend on having a conflict and a war. They are the cheerleaders for these types of horrific things that kill hundreds of thousands and millions of people.
It's so amazing to see how these companies have tremendous leverage on these administrations in the US. It doesn't matter, it's Republican, it's Democrat. We had the war in Iraq, Afghanistan, we had in Serbia, we had in Libya, we had in Syria. All of them together. It doesn't matter who's the president of the United States. These guys are the real decision makers.
Indeed, they are. And in fact, in November, we'll be having a webinar series and a tribunal called the Merchants of Death Tribunal, where we will put on trial for the people to decide whether these companies should be held before an actual court of law, like the International Criminal Court, for their criminal activities. It's called the Merchants of Death Tribunal, and we'll be publicizing it a lot, and hope that many people around the world will watch the webinars that we have, which spell out specifically what these corporations have been doing.
One of the greatest divisions we have right now in the public opinion all around the world, those people who are against this war in Ukraine and those who are in favor of Ukraine sending more weapons to Ukraine, training more, sending F-16, sending cluster bombs, sending everything. Ukraine gonna get out victorious. It's so great to see how Ukraine gonna win this war. If we look at this war, as time went by during this war, Ukraine was losing and losing badly. And each and every stage, they lost lands, they lost everything. These eastern part of Ukraine was the industrial part of Ukraine. They lost this part. People are immigrating from Ukraine to other places. What was the mindset of the Biden administration? Do you think that they thought that Ukraine miraculously gonna win this war?
Well, who knows what they thought? But one would suspicion that probably is true, that they thought somehow the tiny country, well, it's not so tiny, but compared to the Russian Federation, it's tiny, and compared to the military base that Russia has, the Ukrainian military base is very, very small. And they knew from the beginning that the West, NATO countries and the US would have to back up Ukraine. So it appears that they were willing to do that. They were willing to sacrifice many Ukrainian lives and willing to sacrifice really the economic and industrial base of Ukraine. As you mentioned, you know, the eastern part of Ukraine was actually the industrial base for a great part of the old Soviet Union, and now for the independent country of Ukraine. And when you see the destruction in these major, big, huge companies and areas that had steel making, they had boat building, they had all sorts of things. It's just horrific to see what it is, and to think that the US and NATO were willing to sacrifice, and actually the Ukrainian government willing to sacrifice all of that in the name of territorial integrity, which is something that would have to be negotiated anyway, whether it was a year ago or whether it's 10 years from now. Ultimately, this will end in some sort of a negotiated settlement. But tragically, it has already come at the expense of hundreds of lives and the destruction of a part of Ukraine that probably will never be rebuilt.
The other important player in this war was Europe, these European countries. It seems to me that they didn't have any leverage on the Biden administration's policy in Ukraine. They went along without showing a little bit of objection, just saying, no, this is not good for Europe. In September 2022, we had the sabotage of Nord Stream pipeline, which later turned out that it was a huge loss for Germany, for Europe, because it was an attack on Russia and Germany, not on just one of them, on both of them. How do you see this?
Well, yeah, it's amazing that the German government didn't break diplomatic relations with the US over that. I mean, and when you see the extraordinary history of the Nord Stream pipelines, that, it took a lot of negotiations with the Russian Federation, the German government, other governments in Europe, in order to have this natural gas that was coming along a huge long pipeline, and that would reduce the energy costs for Europe substantially, and to allow, essentially, because I would think the US government had notified the German government that they were going to blow that up, and not to have protested vigorously, saying this is one step too far. This is really going to stop our alliance in some ways. I was in Europe in the summer. We did a Peace in Ukraine summit in Vienna, Austria, one of the few remaining neutral countries in the world, but they're not so neutral. The venue that we were to have for Peace in Ukraine summit was changed 2 days before the international community got there, because the trade union that was allowing us to use their facilities got great pressure from the government of Austria and from the ambassador from Ukraine. We traveled not only from Russia into Slovakia, then to Poland, and then to Lviv in Ukraine. And in both Slovakia and Poland, we talked with journalists who said, we've had journalists that have been fired from their positions in newspapers and on television for even talking about the provocations that the US and NATO did to Russia. That if you don't toe the line, that it's all for Ukraine, then you get fired. We really talked to very few people in Europe that were saying, this needs to end, this needs to stop. Most people were saying, we've now seen what the Russian Federation is willing to do. They were willing to attack Ukraine. They may be willing to attack us here in Poland. The Baltic countries are saying the same thing. The Scandinavian countries are saying the same thing. So this provocation that the West did to Russia and Russian response has really made a lot of people in Europe very fearful of their of their national security. And when you have the Scandinavian countries of Finland and Sweden, Finland already joined NATO, Sweden about to, and these being countries that for, the 70 years of NATO said, no, we don't need to join NATO. And their populations were against their countries joining NATO. But now the sentiment in the countries are, well, look what the Russian Federation did. So we better join, some bigger organization that can help protect us in case Russia decides to do the same thing to us, which there's no way in the world you can convince me that the Russian Federation wants to invade anybody else. This was a one-time event. I certainly hope, but there's no indication they want to do anything else unless they are provoked again. So trying to keep the provocations stopped is a main goal of the peace movement as we challenge our own government's policies on these things. And challenging anything that the US government is doing is becoming more and more difficult because we are having attacks on peace organizations for their challenging US policies on China, on US policies in North Korea. We've had 4 major news articles on peace organizations that are challenging US policies in China, North Korea, and certainly the Peace in Ukraine coalition gets targeted all the time because it's not following the US war in Ukraine model.
Biden just recently said that we're running out of ammunition. We had these tremendous weapon companies in the United States, this military industrial complex with all these big budgets, and they cannot provide Ukraine with enough weapons in this war. How does that work?
Well, Biden was being very duplicitous on that. The US military always has orders into all of the munitions companies, all of the weapons manufacturers, that if they start using up a certain amount of it, then they put in another order. And the ammunition factories have been working overtime to, fill the orders. There's way too much ammunition. There's way too many weapons that are available right now to killing other people. The military industrial complex of the United States takes well over 60% of the U.S. budget on war making. So these companies are not, they're not suffering at all. And Biden was being very untruthful when he said we're running out of ammunition. There's no way in the world they're running out of ammunition. We wish they would run out of ammunition, but they're not running out at all.
We have another conflict in Taiwan, just the way they did to Russia. It seems that it's so serious in Taiwan right now. they're pushing so hard from the left and right, from Republican and Democrat. They are talking about the independence of Taiwan. How do you see the U.S. policy in Taiwan?
Well, the U.S. policy in Taiwan mirrors pretty much what our policy on Russia has been, trying to provoke the mainland China into doing something on Taiwan. You know, the U.S. policy for the last 40 years has been a one China policy that was negotiated under the Nixon administration. And while the U.S. stopped recognizing diplomatically Taiwan, the Republic of China, Taiwan, in exchange really for the PRC, People's Republic of China, opening up relations with the United States. And even though we don't officially recognize Taiwan diplomatically, we do have diplomatic facilities in Taiwan. The training facility for U.S. diplomats in their advanced Chinese language training is located where? Taiwan. The U.S. has always sold weapons to Taiwan. And in fact, there's a new request for the sale of $500 million worth of weapons into Taiwan in the next many days. The U.S. is an economic importer from, as most of the world, for all of the things like that of the world. So and as has the People's Republic of China, the country that Taiwan exports the most to is the People's Republic of China, right 100 miles away. And they import a huge amount of the things that they need from China. They're both Chinese. They're brothers and sisters, just like the Koreans are in the Korean Peninsula, and the Vietnamese are on in Vietnam. The independence of Taiwan is kind of an on one level an unspoken thing, although the People's Republic of China is very slowly and methodically getting countries that still recognize Taiwan to get them to move their diplomatic recognition to the People's Republic of China. And that way the PRC feels it's consolidating its diplomatic approach to Taiwan. But you know, while there are a lot of people on Taiwan, I understand, that say, you know, well, understandably, they don't want to be like a Hong Kong part of China. They want their own independence, even though the rest of the world is saying, well, we recognize the PRC, but you know, we still want to get all your goods. And behind the scenes, the countries are saying, we think it's very good that you're independent. You can run your own economic policies that have been very beneficial to your people and all. And we don't really, you know, we've seen what's happened to Hong Kong, and that hasn't been really good for the people of Hong Kong, with all of the oppression and, you know, police actions that have happened to anyone that dissents in Hong Kong. So, you know, it's a challenging situation, but it should not end in any sort of military action. And the U.S. provocations to try, it appears, to have some sort of military confrontation with the naval armadas that the U.S. is sending through the South China Sea, with the huge numbers of aircraft that the U.S. has sent, with the large numbers of delegations that the U.S. has sent, both diplomatic delegations and economic delegations. And with each one of those, the mainland Chinese respond with a large number of aircraft that fly the short distance across the Straits of Taiwan, right to the edge of the air defense zone of Taiwan. And the possibility for an accident, an inadvertent, you know, something happening there that could escalate into military actions is very high. And that's why we need to reduce it. And in fact, just in the last 2 or 3 weeks, I think the Biden administration has finally seen that this is getting a little out of hand, and the Biden administration has sent some high-level administration personnel to China to hopefully talk down its own rhetoric about what the U.S. has been doing. The Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has had high-level talks. The Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, has been to China. We've had economic delegations go. We've had John Kerry, the chief of climate things, has gone to China. And while I'm sure there's in long discussions about the specifics that they go over for, the overarching idea is that the U.S. is not just sanctioning China, but now having dialogue on some levels with China, which the Biden administration had not done in its first 2 years.
Even Kissinger went there to negotiate with Chinese.
Well, that's right. When you dig people up from the grave, so to speak, and send them over, poor old Henry Kissinger, who was the envoy for Richard Nixon, decades ago, when you get him on a plane and send him over pleading, essentially with somebody that's almost 100 years old to go over and please help us get out of this mess that we've created. I think that was a very telling visit.
We know that the policy in Ukraine, how badly went wrong, how badly functioned, and now they're trying to do the same, arming Taiwanese, trying to encourage them to fight. This is unbelievable. Nobody can think of this war between Taiwan and China. China is big, is huge, cannot be, is not even thinkable.
No. Well, definitely the Taiwan government will never attack mainland China. They know what'll happen. And the main thing is to try to make sure that the mainland Chinese know that the U.S. still has a one China policy, is not recognizing Taiwan, but still, like the rest of the world, continues to have strong economic ties to Taiwan, and to try to get it back on what it has been for the last 40 years, which is allowing Taiwan to develop as it wishes, which is essentially as an independent country or independent entity, but just not having the official recognition, and not provoking mainland China, who considers it a rogue province, to do anything to try to bring it totally under the wing of the People's Republic of China.
You know that we need somebody in office in Washington who's willing to negotiate with Xi, with Putin, to solve these problems. The Biden administration, even Biden personally called Xi as a dictator after that meeting of Tony Blinken. When he went to China, when he got back, suddenly out of nowhere, Biden was calling Xi as a dictator. These failed policy, these mixed messages they're sending to Putin and Xi. For them, it seems to me, as a observer, I think there is no adult in the room. What they're talking about.
Well, you're right. I mean, this is normally in our relationships with other countries, you are very careful about the wording that you have, the way you describe other countries, but it certainly seems like the provocative use of language for the leadership of both China and Russia has been on steroids by the United States. The U.S. is always citing North Korea and Kim Jong-un and all of his very descriptive terminology, usually of the U.S. government. It seems like the U.S. is trying to take a page out of the playbook of North Korea and how rude you can be to other countries' leaders, which never results in anything good other than a feel-good policy in Washington. but it's just so abhorrent and so undiplomatic to be doing these things that, as you mentioned, it doesn't seem like there are many adults in the room on this.
We know these policymakers significantly are Tony Blinken, Jack Sullivan, and Victoria Nuland. Victoria Nuland was in Washington since George Bush Jr. She was making these policies, these aggressive policies toward the other countries. Right now, it doesn't matter you have a Republican, you have a Democrat. She's always there. She's always making these decisions, these coups. In your opinion, how we can have some changes in these foreign policies in the US?
Well, it's very hard to get these policies changed. I mean, we are trying very, very much with our going into the Congress to see if the Congress can help get policies changed. But in general, the congressional committees are reflecting what each administration is doing. I mean, it's when you have Senator Menendez as the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he is such a, I would say, a right winger in terms of policies toward Cuba, toward North Korea, toward Iran, toward China, and a cheerleader for the war in Ukraine. It's very, very difficult for us to get any sort of traction. In fact, even when we finally got a group of progressive Democrats to sign a letter almost a year ago saying there should be peace in Ukraine, one day after the letter was published with 30 some odd signatures, they took it back because they got such response from the Democratic leadership in the House of Representatives that they had to rescind the letter. And these were some of the people that we've worked with for a long time on trying to have peace in the world rather than war. And yet they were so arm twisted by the leadership of the Democratic Party that they backed off a statement saying there should be negotiations and work for peace instead of continued war. So it's tough. And, we may have demonstrations in front of the White House, as we did 2 weeks ago on peace on the Korean Peninsula. We'll be having peace in Ukraine demonstrations in Washington and around the country in the first week of October. We have email campaigns and telephone campaigns into the members of Congress. We're doing everything we can as grassroots organizations to try to affect a change. We will be having lots of people that'll be going to the various presidential town halls to try to get in there to ask maybe just one question on foreign policy. In the last presidential elections, there were virtually no questions that were ever asked on U.S. foreign policy. So we'll try to get into those town halls and see if we can't get the candidates. They'll be the candidates on the Republican side. Actually, they did talk yesterday about foreign policy. We assume that Biden will probably be the Democratic nominee, and it will be very difficult. He won't have any town halls probably. But we will continue to do what we can to keep raising these issues and trying to get a change in our government's policies.
Do you think he's physically, mentally is capable of being reelected?
Well, whether he's able to continue the job is the question. Whether the American public feels that they should vote for him, considering that he's 80 years old, that one hopes he's still in good mental condition. We hope. So far, there haven't been any reports that has dementia or anything like that, as started happening with Ronald Reagan. So we hope he's in good mental shape, and we hope he stays in good physical. You certainly don't want the president of it is to fall in difficult mental, because that then means that democracy is taking over more and more. from it. Well, and in one way, maybe you want it. I don't know, but you certainly hope that the mental capacity for anyone who's elected to these offices is not harmed while they're in office.
It's so amazing to see what they did to Bernie Sanders. He tried to shake up a little bit this Democratic Party, but they swallowed. They just swallowed him. They put him in a position that he has to play balls with them. And it was the end of Bernie Sanders. And
yeah, it's terrible. The political situation in the United States, where we only have two major parties, is a disaster. As much as people try to run within the party, as Bernie Sanders tried to do, or tries to form a coalition of third parties, which has been attempted in the past, and then are always accused of being the reason why the Democrats didn't win or the Republicans didn't win. Until we really get a strong third party, we will really keep wallowing in the same political mess that we're in, and where the leadership of the party itself can make such career-ending decisions as what happened really with Bernie Sanders, who was a viable candidate for the nomination when ultimately Joe Biden won. But Bernie Sanders was a very strong candidate, but then the leadership of the Democratic Party came in hard on that, saying no more. And the same that they did for Hillary Clinton, to eliminate the opposition or the challengers to Hillary Clinton's nomination.
We have RFK Jr. He's trying to get inside this Democratic Party. Do you see any chance for him in this party?
Well, he is trying hard. I think his views on a couple of topics have kind of undercut his challenge to become a viable candidate. I think his decision to keep going after the COVID, saying COVID was I wouldn't say a hoax, but maybe COVID vaccination was not what the general public needed, and his very strong support for the state of Israel has meant that within at least progressive elements of the country, that he is not coming forward as a strong candidate as one had thought he might be able to do.
Because we know he's under attack. He's first they attacked him that he's anti-Semitic. Then he had another interview then after that interview they said no, he's pro-Israel. It seems to me they wanna find a way, just the way they did to Bernie Sanders. The same thing is happening to RFK Jr. They're trying to vanish him from the political arena. How do you see this?
Well, yeah, I mean, the corporate media starts picking its favorites, and much of the corporate media is, they want to stay in good relationship with whomever's in power. So, it's our corporate media does not do any favors to the American public and how it covers the political scene in the United States. And I think RFK Jr. is seeing that very, very dramatically, as Bernie Sanders has seen it, as Jill Stein of the Green Party.
We have Cornel West right now.
West, who's not getting any publicity anywhere.
No.
So, this is part of the big challenges of our political environment in the United States, which, we always tout it's such a great democracy, but between the media interference in elections and our very antiquated electoral system with the Electoral College, which has meant that at least two of the persons who got the popular vote in the presidential election were not elected as president, and that was Al Gore and Hillary Clinton. Both of them had millions more votes than George Bush Jr. and then Donald Trump. And yet those with fewer popular votes got elected because of the Electoral College.